Every veteran has vivid memories of their time deployed. A memory that stands out in my mind are the buses. These buses were filled with Iraqi citizens, and they were headed to the Jordanian and the Syrian border. The US occupation had caused massive instability. People's safety was in question, and nobody really knew what the following months would bring. In short, the war had caused them to be displaced. Now, displacement happens in many different contexts outside of conflict as well. For example, gentrification, a very American phenomenon, is a form of displacement. In Brazil, tens of thousands of people were forcefully displaced from the favelas in order to make way for the 2016 Olympics. Climate change is happening at such rapidly increasing rates that climate refugees are increasing all over the world. And spatial inequality exists to such an extent that you can literally see a form of economic displacement happening in a single photograph. The UN estimates that there are currently 68 million people around the world who are displaced, which, if we consolidated them, would stand among the 20 most populous countries in the world. But the question that is often missing when we talk about this entire displacement phenomenon is, what happens when people who have been displaced have the ability or the option to return home? Where do they go? How do they legally reclaim their land and their homes? How do they pick up the pieces and rebuild their communities? Well, this past year, and in part thanks to the Tillman Foundation, I had the opportunity to visit the small, beautiful East African country of Rwanda. Now, some of you here may remember, Rwanda in 1994 had a massive genocide and left 800,000 people dead and over 1 million people displaced. Although the genocide itself lasted just 100 days, there was decades of conflict and displacement leading up to it. And this created a cycle of movements into and out of the country. A constant form of displacement was occurring throughout all of this, and there was no ability to organize and manage the resettlement process. So resettlement in itself can be a very controversial issue. And I want to note here that what is currently happening in Rwanda has the potential for lasting political and rights implications. However, my research focused solely on the use of model villages, pictured here, as the final stage of Rwanda's multi-decade resettlement process. The families I had the opportunity to visit were rural farmers, as well as a few genocide survivors who were mostly orphans and widows. These model villages keyed in on a vulnerable, once displaced population and provided for the resettlement by building schools, clinics, infrastructure, and utilities. Prior to living in these villages, families had been living in a constant state of displacement and usually pretty far from resources. Upon moving into a model village, each family is given a cow. The manure in these cows is used for methane for cooking. Solar panels were used for electricity. Rainwater was collected for use in the home. And starter seeds were allocated for use in the fields outside of the villages. These model villages were actually so well equipped that wealthier Rwandans are building homes on the periphery in order to gain access to many social resources within. From an urban planning and sustainability point of view, these villages are mindful of increasing land scarcity, use of renewable resources, and providing economic opportunities for the many once displaced and vulnerable Rwandans who are now living within. Recognizing and understanding the significant effort that is required to accommodate displaced people should be recognized as the most important aspect of the entire displacement phenomenon. And Rwanda offers just one example of how it's possible to resettle. But what responsibility do we as the international community have when it comes to providing for returning refugees as they return to Baghdad, for example, or Afghanistan, or Syria? What does resettlement look like in urban environments or in communities that have been reduced to rubble? Is it the role of international organizations to provide infrastructure development, healthcare, access to economies and food supplies? These are very real questions, and questions that governments all the way down to the local community will have to continue to grapple with as the continual cycle of displacement and resettlement plays out around the world. So I propose that let's stop talking about displacement as an end state, but rather as a phase of movement where the ultimate goal is to always have the ability to return home. Thank you.